Okay, in this video, I'm going to show you how to find the price of a perishable item when you have to take into consider that you might have some spoilage. So, in general, the idea of what we're trying to do is we're trying to find the total sales and divide by the number of items we're trying to sell, and that would give us the price per item. So, for example, if I am selling kickballs, and let's say I have 10 kickballs, and I want to make $10. So I would take the total sales that I want to make, which would be $10, and I would divide by the number of kickballs, which would be 10, and then that would help me decide how to price them. So I would price them at $1 per kickball. So this is the whole idea of what we're trying to do. So we have to do some steps here. The first step is we need to figure out the total sales. That's in the first step. We're going to find the total sales. Then the second step is we're going to try to figure out the number of items that we're going to sell. And then in the third step, we're just going to do the division where I take the total sales divided by the number of items. Okay, so we're going to use the knowledge that we learned in the previous section about marking up on selling price or marking up on cost to determine the total sales. So in example A, it says Audrey's Bake Shop baked 20 dozen bagels. Audrey expects 10% of the bagels to become stale and not be able to sell them. The bagels cost Audrey $1.20 per dozen, and Audrey wants to do a 60% markup on cost. I always like to highlight that so that I remember what I need to make the base. What should Audrey charge for each dozen bagels so she can make her profit? Okay, so the first thing in the first step, we want to figure out the total sales. So we got to use the total cost plus the dollar markup would give me the total sales. I'm going to make my chart just like before. Okay, now because it says the markup is on cost, I know that the total cost is going to be my base, so I want to make sure I label that. Okay, and we want the amount that it goes up to be 60%, which means the total sales, when I add those, would give me 160% of the total cost. Now it says here she has 20 dozen bagels, and it costs her $1.20 per dozen to make them. So the eggs, the flour, all those ingredients that she needs to make those bagels, it costs her $1.20 per dozen. So to figure out what the total cost is, it tells us what the cost is per dozen, but we need to figure out the total cost to figure out the total sales. So I'm going to take $1.20 for each dozen, so that's 20 dozen, and so the total cost is going to be $24. So it's going to cost her $24 to make the 20 dozen bagels. Now, that's all the information that we can gather right now from the problem. So now I'm going to make my circle so I can figure out what the total sales are. That's what we're trying to figure out in step 1. My base, the amount of the base is always going to go in this bottom left corner. And the amount of the base, since the base is cost, is going to be $24. I'm looking for the total sales. I'm going to label it TS. And I know that that's 160%. And when I put that in as a decimal, it should be 1.6. So to find the total sales, I'm going to take 24 times $1.60. So my total sales, $38.40. So for step number 1, we have found that it's going to take her $24 to make the bagels, and then she's going to sell them for $38.40, so that difference will be a profit for her, which will be the 60%. Now, step 2, we want to figure out, based on previous history, she thinks about 10% is going to spoil. And we want to figure out how much she's going to be able to sell, because that's step number 2, right? We take the total sales divided by how much she expects to sell. Well, 10% is how much is going to spoil, so 90% is what we expect to sell. So using my circle again, if I have 20 dozen bagels, and I think 90% of those I'm going to sell, I'm going to put in 0.9 for my rate. What I'm looking for is the portion. What portion of that 20 is the 90%? So I'm going to take 20 times 0.9, and that's going to be the number of dozens of bagels that she's going to be able to sell that she doesn't think is going to go stale. And when I take 20 times 0.9, I get 18 dozen. So the last step is to take the total sales, which we figured out in number 1, which was $38.40, and she thinks she's going to be able to sell 18 dozen. So I'm going to take 38.40 and divide it by 18, and I'm going to get $2.13 per dozen. So this is what she should charge for each dozen of bagels. Okay, let's go through one more just to make sure you've got it. So we have step 1 where we're figuring out the total sales. Step 2 where we figure out the number of items that they think they're going to sell. And then step 3 is to divide. So Alvin Rose owns a fruit and vegetable stand. He knows that he cannot sell his produce at full price. Alvin must put a high enough price on the produce to cover the markdowns in rotted produce and still make his desired profit. Alvin bought 300 pounds of tomatoes at 14 cents per pound. He expects 5% spoilage and marks up the tomatoes at 20% on the selling price. We're going to figure out how much per pound that Alvin should charge for his tomatoes. So it's 20% on the selling price. So when I figure out what the total sales is, I'm going to use the selling price as my base. So I'm going to have the total cost plus the dollar markup would give me my total sales. Now, since the selling price is the base, we're going to mark this as 100%, so this is our base. And then the percent increase is going to be the 20%. And since whatever the percent of the total cost is, plus the 20% has to be equal to 100%, the total cost percent has to be 80%. Okay, now we got to figure out the total cost. It says that he bought 300 pounds of tomatoes at 14 cents per pound. So to find out in total how much this cost him, we're going to take 300 times 14 cents. And when we multiply that out, we're going to get $42. So his total cost is $42. Now to figure the total sales, remember we always use the column with the base. We don't want to use the DM column here because we don't have enough information to be able to use that, right? We would have 2 unknowns. So I'm going to use this column here. And I'm going to put that in my circle. My base always goes in this left bottom corner. And that's the amount of the base, which is what we're looking for. I'm going to label it TS for total sales. We know that the cost is 42 and the rate for the cost is 0.80. So to figure out the total sales, I'm going to take 42 divided by 0.80. And 42 divided by 0.80 is 52.50. So his total sales is $52.50. He starts at 42, which is what it cost him to purchase the tomatoes. Then he marks it up 20, and he's going to try to sell them for $52.50. Now, the second step is to figure out how much he expects to be able to sell. Based on previous knowledge or previous experience, he knows that probably about 5% is going to spoil. So, which means he expects to be able to sell about 95%. So, using my circle, I want to sell 95%, so my rate's going to be 0.95. My base is 300, and we're trying to figure out what part of that 300 is 95%. How much are we going to sell? So I'm going to take 300 times 0.95 to figure out how much of these tomatoes he's going to sell. So of the 300 pounds, he thinks he's going to be able to sell about 285 pounds. So the last step is to take the total sales, which we found in step 1, which is $52.50, divide by the amount of tomatoes that he thinks he's going to be able to sell, which is 285 pounds. And when we divide that, we get 18 cents per pound is what he should sell them for. So he bought them at 14 cents, and he's going to mark them up at 18 cents so that he can make that profit.